We're recording this on Tuesday, May 6th, and yesterday, Monday, May 5th, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith went on TV and made a rather extraordinary 18-minute speech in which she basically demanded that the number of concessions be made by the Canadian government or around the oil and gas industry, or Alberta would start looking at some kind of separation or sovereignty association kind of relationship. So I'm going to talk to energy economist Chris Bataille about the economic implications of that. So welcome to the interview, Chris.
Great to be here, Markham.
Well, it's good to have you back. I always appreciate your measured response to these things because these are very uncertain, times. So the Smith asked for four things on behalf of the government. I'll just give them to you quickly. Guaranteed access via energy corridors to ports on the east, the west, and the north coast. Right to export as much oil and gas as the free market can take. Removal of all legislation like C-69 and C-48 and any regulations that Alberta finds objectionable, like the oil and gas emissions cap and the clean electricity standard. And then fourth, no export tax on oil and gas going to the United States, which has been contemplated in response to President Donald Trump's tariffs. So we've heard all of this stuff before. Put it all together, particularly with the request, for market access and the ports. This is rather an extraordinary, I don't know what we call it a demand, but it's certainly an extraordinary request on behalf of Alberta for their industry.
Yeah, and hearing that speech and hearing those details, it's a little bit difficult to process, but on a certain track, I almost feel like Smith is playing two games. There's a political game for her base, right? And working up her base and what have you, and keeping that conversation going. And then there's the real conversation with the feds as to what's possible, right? Because just, what she did on face value is extortion. And that just doesn't work in Canada.
Yeah.
It's historically, we're 10 provinces with very different all pros and cons and relationships with the world and different industries, and we have to negotiate with each other within the federation. And it's been like this since we separated from Great Britain in early stages, right? All the provinces have rights. They have rights to do due diligence, impact statements on them. Quebec has repeatedly said they don't want more oil crossing Quebec. BC put up a big fight against TMX because of the concern about potential tanker crashes and what have you. And the feds forced it through. They added more resources here for the Coast Guard in case something went wrong, and did a lot of work that way. But they literally forced it through, and that is on the behalf of Alberta. And most of the benefits are showing up now as a smaller Hardisty discount. So the oil is selling at a higher premium because the extra can come down TMX and go out to the west. I feel she's really pushing it. She's really pushing what does sorry, you have a question.
Well, I want to make this observation, and I do ask you a question. You and I have had many interviews over the years about what's going on with the global energy system, the energy
Yes.
transition. And you put a lot of time and effort into research on green steel, uh,
Yes.
clean industrial processes. So you're plugged into what's going on at the global level. All of the things that Smith has asked for is essentially a doubling down on the traditional oil and gas economy, which, I mean, the International Energy Agency has forecast peak oil demand and gas demand by 2030, and possibly a fairly steep decline after that. Well, we don't have a crystal ball, but that's what they're forecasting. Doing all of this would require an extraordinary investment in infrastructure and in assets, which
Hmm.
could, within a very short period of time, become stranded. And they would probably require some level of public investment, which then could be lost. So this is no small matter. This is not just a matter of, there's a good economic argument for this. The math works out, okay, fine, we'll give it to Alberta. There's a lot at stake in making this request. Is it risky? I think it's very risky. Would you agree?
Personally, I think it's existentially risky because it would require a lot of federal funds. It would require the federal government to backstop a lot of that investment, bring their borrowing capacity to it. Um, Borrowing markets can only take so much right now. Literally, new investment has come to a halt with the global tariff war going on. There's only so much. A lot of investments across the country and globally have just stopped. Case in point, there's a ultra low emissions chemical plant that Dow was building in Alberta, and they were building and they stopped it because they didn't want to spend any more money right now, right? And that was an investment in a low emissions and net zero emissions fossil fuel orientated future for Alberta. And my personal point of view would be Alberta, if it really wants to prepare for a low emissions future that based on anchored on fossil fuels, it would be investing more in a lot more renewable energy in plants like that Dow chemical plant and going for the high valued end of the market. So chemical products, what have you, electrifying as much of the oil production industry as they can as it sort of eases down. What she's assuming with her demands is the oil demand is just going to keep on going up, and we know it won't. It's going to hit a peak sooner or later, and it's going to start falling, and we can debate when that happens, but it will happen within the decade.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, thanks to you, I will say about 5, 6 years ago, you're the one who put me on to an interest in energy modeling, energy demand modeling.
Mm-hmm,
And so, as part of my journalism, I read probably 8 to 10 modelers on a regular basis. You know, the OPEX, the IEA,
mm-hmm,
Bloomberg, NEF, Rystad, on and on. And yes, everybody almost as there are two camps. One, peak demand in 2030, and then lots of debate about what the post 2030 world looks like, if it plateaus or declines, whatever. Then there's the hardcore in OPEC, which
mm-hmm.
is, forecasting significant growth out to 2050. And I know from following Danielle Smith's speeches and been in media conferences with her, she believes in OPEC's view. Like that worldview is the one that she believes in. It's the one the Alberta oil and gas industry believes in. They think it's not the end of the age of oil. They think it's the golden age of hydrocarbons it's coming. That is not a view that's widely held, as you pointed
Mm-hmm.
out. And this seems to be there's no bridge between here. There's no middle ground because they certainly Smith and the industry in Alberta have not given ground on this particular issue. And I don't think Canada can give ground anymore because of the level of risk that's attached to this. Would you agree?
Yeah, I don't think Canada we have a federal fiscal issue to deal with. We have a very, very large accumulated debt we now have to pay interest on. We have to be very careful what we spend money on in both the short and the long run in terms of new infrastructure. And we shouldn't be taking on anything that hasn't got long-term guaranteed long-term value from the federal point of view. And I certainly don't think investing in more oil production is a wise use of our federal tax funds.
Fair enough. Well, let's get on to the second issue here, and that is uh, Prime Minister Mark Carney, throughout the recent federal election campaign, when he was Liberal leader, laid out a plan, or at least the bare bones of a plan. It wasn't really a plan, bare bones of a plan, a strategy for re-engineering the Canadian economy, east-west, expanding to new trading partners, presumably in Asia and Europe, and adding value to resources and investing in clean energy. And it was very different. In order if and to do it post haste because of the threat from Trump and the United States. The problem here is, as you mentioned earlier, in Canada, we have a decentralized federation, and the provinces have considerable constitutional authority over resources and other areas of the economy. Nothing happens unless we're all on the same page. If there's not a
Mm-hmm.
united front, and her threat of pursuing a separatist agenda last night basically has the potential to throw a spanner into the works of Mark Carney's and the federal government's plan. How bad could it be?
Unfortunately, okay, so you look at the real politic of it, right? Maybe 20%, maximum 20% of Albertans would vote positive for such a measure. Um, and without even if even if you got over the 50% mark, what have you, the First Nations would be taking the Alberta government to court for the next half century to stay in Canada, right? If not arming themselves to do so, So, and they sit on top of the oil sands. So, the the thing here is I don't Alberta's just highly unlikely to separate, but it's the sheer threat of separation, and the fact is it's showing up every day in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and all the various in the Financial Times and what have you. It's making investors nervous. It's making investors nervous about Canada, about committing capital specifically to any sort of energy projects, what have you. And it's going to make capital more expensive for all of us, and for any of those projects specifically. If they really push it and try to hold this thing in 2026, you're going to see a freeze on new capital for well over a year. It just won't happen, right? Because people will be afraid of no one thought Brexit would happen, and Brexit happened. No one thought Trump would get elected in 2016. Trump was elected. People are now very nervous of black swan political events, and that could be a black swan political event. It could literally bring a halt to new investment in Canada.
So if you look at it from Smith's point of view, and I made this argument yesterday in a video, so I'll make it again here. She essentially was the handmaiden of the oil and gas industry, putting forth their agenda and saying, if you don't do this, we're going to create problems for you within Canada. That's essentially the argument she made. And she wasn't very subtle about it either. So if she does that, not only can she sidetrack or bog down the Prime Minister's plan to restructure the Canadian economy, she can torpedo a lot of the existing Canadian economy by blocking access, or that's not the right word, inhibiting
Raising
access to
us
capital and raising the cost of capital.
People who have lots of money are allergic to risk. You raise risk, you raise your cost of access to that, it may freeze yourself out completely. Like that's the bottom line.
And the irony, of course, is that she keeps accusing the federal government of doing that thing, the thing that which she is doing herself. Okay, well, let's talk about the third issue here. And uh, Prime Minister Mark Carney is in Washington meeting with Donald Trump as we record this, and they're having the first talk about renegotiating the trade agreement, the U.S., Mexico, Canada,
Mm-hmm.
CUSMA, USMCA, whatever you want to call it. And 2 months ago, even a month ago, we were all convinced that things had changed forever and that we had to do radical things in a hurry. Even the prime minister talked that way. Now, Trump has softened his position with respect to that, and you can see the glimmer of maybe this is like a repeat of Trump 1.0, where lots of bombast and threats and so on and so forth, and then he negotiates a new, the free trade agreement, and it's really only got, this much of change, and we go back to essentially the status quo. And it looks like a carbon copy of that. Would that be your take on this?
No, again, uncertainty is always one of the things
Yeah.
I'm looking for, right? And the problem we had 30 odd years of certainty since the free trade agreement with the Americans. It was an ever deeper relationship, more trade, more, value added parts of the chain, supply chains going up and down from Mexico up to Ontario and what have you. And the simple fact that he could threaten to do it, just break the treaty, abrogate the treaty, right? Put on huge tariffs or threaten to put them on, week by week, say he's going to put them on, then take them off. Like, again, we have to remember, new investment came to a halt. Car plants in Ontario had to lay off workers just because of the talk, right? Now, if say this is all hunky dory and we get another CUSMA 2.0, there's nothing to say we don't get a Vance after him or someone else who does the same thing over and over again. And basically, we have to think of this. It's like being in an extortive relationship with somebody, where they're constantly coming back to you for more. And there's a threat and bombast, then they're nice and then they're not. Like, the only way you stop those people is by finding some other conduit. Like you can still keep talking with them and dealing with them, but you have to find other connections to the world, right? And I do think there's going to be a temptation to try to return to that old system, but we have to beef up our east west connections. Like we have to reconnect to Europe. We have to, I would have to say we have to come to a diplomatic concord with the Chinese, with the growing East Asian industrial powers, with the Chinese, and have a stable relationship with them. Because if the Americans aren't stable, we need to be able to look elsewhere.
Well, I think that this is a very good discussion of the coming negotiations or the conversation that needs to take place in Canada, which is, are we going to invest in tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of new oil and gas infrastructure? Yay or nay? Are we going to let Danielle Smith in Alberta disrupt all of our economic plans with talk of separation? Yay or nay? Is there a chance to go back to the status quo, or should we do what you just suggested, build new relationships with Asia, China, and Europe? Yay or nay? That's essentially the conversation that needs to take place over the next little while, and not get caught up in all of the bombast and the yelling and the so on that goes on, with conversations with Alberta. Does that sound like a reasonable approach?
Yeah, and we need to. I would suggest we used to do industrial policy like this. Think long term. Like that's how we got the railway. That's how we got the various bits of infrastructure that hold the country together. It just got too easy just to keep on selling things to the American at the least cost in a free trade environment. There was no thinking involved. You just keep doing more of it, right? I think we need to keep that relationship. These are our closest. These are the closest people we're closest to in the world, most similar to us, period, right? But we also need to think about the long term. And, any healthy adult has multiple connections to the rest of the world, not just to one, but we need to behave like an adult nation.
Well, on that note, the adult nation is watching with fingers crossed as our Prime Minister talks to the American president. We'll see how that turns out. Chris, as a pleasure as always, thank you very much for this.
My pleasure, Markham. Anytime.